We'll get started. Please can all guests make sure their microphones and cameras are off just for the duration of this, please. Thank you very much. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on pressure points, building a stronger support system for university students. My name is Katie, and I'm a marketing executive at Epigeum. Epigeum is a leading provider of online training supporting the needs of higher education institutions in 3 core areas: research, studying, and sport and wellbeing. Today, we're going to be discussing this last area, particularly the challenges students face regarding mental health and wellbeing, and exploring how universities can support their students, for example, with our upcoming programme Pressure Points. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 expert speakers on this topic today. Please welcome Dr. John Sharpe, Director of Student and Academic Services at the University of East Anglia; Melinda Green, the Manager for the Student Counselling and Wellbeing team at Charles Sturt University in Australia; and Dr. Dominique Thompson, a multi-award-winning GP, young people's mental health expert, TEDx speaker, author and educator with 2 decades of clinic experience. So before we get started, just a few notes for everyone attending today. We have a Q&A box this side, so please drop in any questions at the start, throughout, and we will try to answer those towards the end of the call. The webinar is being recorded today, and we will share the recording soon after the event. And as I've mentioned, please ensure your cameras and microphones are kept off. Now that the housekeeping is done, let's get going. So my first question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge to student mental health and wellbeing today? And we'd like to start with John.
That's a big question, and I've been thinking about it, and I think there are 2 bits to it for me. So if I think of it purely as a person, that sounds odd. I'm not suggesting when I'm in my work that I'm not a person, but from a purely human perspective, I think the biggest challenge is that globally it's quite odd. We're in very quietly a period of extraordinary change that we're not talking about a huge amount. We're potentially in the next 30 years approaching a post-work economy. We've got climate emergency. We've got political instability that we haven't seen in decades. And so if I strip out the student-specific element, I think the biggest challenge is the world in which we're all trying to live and how unstable and complex and increasingly complex that is. And if you then think about a typical student for us at UEA, and not all students by any means, but a typical student tends to be a young adult. So you're dealing with that whilst also trying to figure out yourself and how you relate to that, and how you relate to others, and how you relate to yourself. And I'm not sure that in the last 10 years, socially, we've made that an easier growing process for people. I think we've actually inadvertently made that harder for people, whether that's to do with isolation caused by people interacting predominantly over social media rather than face-to-face, the COVID impact. So on that sort of the human level, from a professional perspective, I think the biggest challenge that faces us in terms of working with our students are the increasing demands, particularly from government, for universities to be something more and different to a university. But that was a really long and rambling answer, so I'll stop there.
No, it was an excellent answer. Thank you. Melinda, I saw you nodding along at the end there. Would you like to answer next?
No, I agree with John, and obviously I'm thinking from an Australian perspective and where we're at, and obviously very similar sort of challenges that John was talking about. I also think when I'm looking at as a manager of our counselling services here at Charles Sturt, we're thinking about there's a lot more complex concerns coming through. So for us to have a student come through just for exam anxiety or anything like that is very far and few. We're getting quite a number of students who, obviously are coming with multiple diagnoses. So it's, there's a couple more things happening. I think for us, as a university and, obviously having that free service and I suppose a little bit quicker to get in into our services and stuff, there's a big backlog of support in the mental health sector for us in Australia where, people in general can't get into, any of your psychologists or psychiatrists, within an 8-month period. So there's huge wait lists, there's huge human resource shortages. We have sort of also fragmented, service delivery models as well. So, it's just more as in, there's not enough resource around to fill the spots. We've got a lot of vacancies and all those sort of things. And there's a massive big treatment gap as well sometimes where, anxiety and depression, we've got an increase of them, but also ADHD, we've seen a big spike since the aftermath of COVID, that's come through as well. Obviously the neurodiversity as well has come through. So just sort of having a look at those big challenges. And I think as staff, if I think about our staff members and our clinicians as well, is, we've gone from online telehealth services to then back to face-to-face. So it's that technical skills versus how to, maneuver and try and provide that best type of clinical support to our students as well. So so that's what I think anyway.
No, that's amazing. Thank you. What about you, Dom?
Well, it's a perfect storm, isn't it? It's what we're hearing everywhere is that uncertainty, which, John was alluding to, that feeling for young people in particular, but obviously, anyone who's off to university, of just not knowing what university holds, what the future holds, and uncertainty is a state that humans don't really like unless you are a massive risk taker in life, and not many of us are. Then most of us, our human reaction to uncertainty is anxiety. And so, the problem with this idea that what's the biggest challenge is that there isn't just one challenge. There are so many challenges to student mental health that I would say, if I had to pick out a couple of things that are really impacting, I would say anxiety and isolation. If the sort of disconnection from their social peers and their friends and making new friends and so on over the last 3 or 4 years, those have been devastating, and those are going to have knock-on effects. But I think it's this perfect storm of worrying about the now, worrying about the future, worrying about having a job, worrying about the planet. I mean, they're just worrying about everything all the time. And that is fair enough. If I had to be really controversial, and, obviously I don't like to do that too often, I would say that NHS is a challenge to student mental health because the workforce is so depleted. So in the UK, the lack of staff, and they are working as hard as they can, but the complete underfunding and lack of staff is a challenge because we can't get the help for the people who need it the most, which then has a knock-on effect to everybody in the queue behind them. So I think I've thrown a few things out there, but it's a really complex picture, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think a few things we've kind of alluded to through that is how kind of universal these issues are. So my next question is, how can universities ensure that mental health support is accessible and inclusive for all students, including those from underrepresented groups? And shall we start with Dom, since you went last time?
Yes, I mean, gosh, this one is tricky, isn't it? I think being accessible and inclusive is definitely something everybody is trying really hard to do, to think about, to be a bit creative about. For me, I guess what I try maybe to do is think, where are we not seeing the student groups that we want to be seeing? So if, I'm taking just an example, if we're saying we need males, men, boys, whatever, but young boys as well, because I look after teens, but at university, men to come forward for support, and we know that they don't tend to present as much to GPs, as much to counselling services. Well, maybe then we need to not look at ways to get them through the door, but actually think, well, where are they? Let's go to them. I know it's not rocket science, but what are we actually aiming to do to make it accessible? How do we define accessible? Are we saying the counselling service is not accessible? Actually, in most places, it's very accessible, but it's not accessible to that group. So actually, we need to think differently about what we define as accessible, and how do we make the support easy to access, but maybe it isn't in the same format, location, hub, whatever, as we have traditionally expected it to be. I say that yet as a GP who tried to do things differently on my own campus, and I even walked around on campus with a tabard, like, I'm a GP, ask me anything. Yeah, that didn't work. I'm just telling you right now, don't bother doing that one. Look like a right twit, and and no one came to speak to me. So I am saying that we do need to be creative and try new things, but I think making it accessible, means different things to different people. I think we should come back to that idea. I'm sure we will, but I'd love to hear what the others, not what they've done to make a twit of themselves, of course, but what we can do to make it more accessible.
Yeah, of course. How about you, Melinda?
Yeah, no, I agree. This one's a bit of a hard question. And I think like it's a tricky one, and it depends on sort of the setup of our universities, because obviously every university is set up quite differently. And I'm thinking as in, it's hard because you can advertise and you can promote, you can do it all through the onboarding platforms, all of those sort of things. But then you think students are often bombarded with so much communication that it just gets missed, which is really a shame, because some of that important information, but it's just so congested, when they start university as well. So I'm just trying to think as in for us it's the word of mouth, and being able to really talk about that ability to get that extra support around mental health, and looking at that students can get that flexibility and adaptability or reasonable adjustments to their study if they are experiencing certain mental health conditions, besides your normal medical conditions or physical conditions or anything like that. But knowing that, a mental health condition can be part of that inclusiveness of, getting some reasonable adjustments. So, so I think it's sort of how you do that. I'm still searching for the answer, and I think as a team we are still searching for an answer. But I think it's around sort of really, it's that constant and consistent messaging throughout all our faculties and teaching staff, but also, on our platforms, and may that be through, constant conversations through social media and all of those sort of things, or even, stories from other students, how they have found the service, and getting that mental health support and the reasonable adjustments might help, that connection, I suppose, to someone's story. So there's a couple of ideas, but I'm just trying to think as in what else can happen.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
How about you, John?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I don't think there is a university out there that's fixed this yet. So I've got a controversial view. I'll save that for last. One thing we have done at UEA, which I think is helping, and actually, interestingly enough, the person who runs that area is actually on this webinar, so I will embarrass them now. So we have a student information zone at UEA. It doesn't sit either in my area, in either my areas, academic services or student services. It sits within a separate area, have student and graduate success. And how I think it is helping us see more students, particularly in relation to wellbeing issues, is there's a kind of a scariness about going along to student services and saying, I think I need to see someone. almost the simple act of enabling students to go along to an information zone, which helps them with everything from how do I get a bus pass to how do I get someone to fix my laptop, but also includes things like, can I get an appointment to see someone about X? I think it makes it seem less of a scary issue. It feels less like they're saying there is something quote unquote wrong with me, and it becomes just one of the many things they can go and ask about. So it's a small thing, but I think that has helped. We still have all the same issues every other university does, though. It doesn't fix it. The second thing is about talking to students, especially students from those groups, to try and find out what could we do differently that they can tell us we could do differently. One of the phrases when I meet with new staff in my areas and say there are certain things I don't like, and one of the things I really dislike is the phrase hard to reach students, because it just feels like an excuse. We don't have hard to reach students. We have students for whom we haven't yet figured out what we need to be doing differently. And then the controversial bit which ties to that is pre-HE, I worked in the corporate sector. I was in corporate accountancy and consulting. And I'm weirdly comfortable with the idea that students are customers as well as being other things. They are also customers. And I sometimes think that because as universities we care about our students, we are very focused on what we think the students might need, which is not the same as the marketing question, because the marketing question isn't what does the customer need? It's how do I get them to buy this, which is usually a weirdly different approach to anything that looks like it's necessarily addressing the need. And I think if we thought more, I know it sounds a bit crass, but I think it could work if we think more about the tricks and techniques of marketing in terms of how do you make it easy for students to think, oh, I might go and utilize that service that's available. We will be delivering the thing we really want to, which is good services for our students, even if we're using inevitably manipulative techniques to get there. So that's my controversial suggestion. But yeah, it's really hard. It really is difficult.
Yeah, no, I think kind of into the next question, it's thinking about these like innovative ways of getting students involved in it, and what are other, beyond going out on campus and trying to speak to people, like what are the innovative ways either you guys have worked with or other universities use that support student mental health and well-being? Should we start with Melinda this time?
Yeah, no, that's all right. Yeah, I think that you can. There's always lots of ways of doing things, and and I think it's really quite important to sometimes, as what John was talking about, is that customer experience, and I think involving our students in sort of thinking about a framework that might really help understand what's working, what's not working. Well, what would they like to see? What is easily accessible, I suppose, or what's quick? Maybe it might be not sitting there for an hour lecture talking about mental health. It might be something really quick they might need. So, even we've been floating around. Just recently is thinking about, getting more student casuals and employing students, and giving them that incentive to really think about that sort of stuff and going out and doing a little bit of research. Obviously, we'll have to go through ethics, but thinking about those sort of things and, building sort of some framework that would fit or might fit in some respect. Around some student mental health concerns, but also what we can do better, but also, really thinking about just that continuous evaluation, I suppose, of how do we reach certain cohorts of students that might not want to come to our service or might not know our services? Like, are we not advertising enough, or are we only reaching like a small arm of our students and not the full arm? So what we can do differently. So yeah, I think that it's a bit of there could be lots of things. And I think, and it's often a bit tricky when you've got multiple campuses. So for Charles Sturt, we've got multiple campuses, and the distance between our campuses is quite large. So it's a little bit tricky, so it's how do you replicate that on each campuses? And we've got different courses or collective of courses on each campuses, and that what they specialise in as well. So, it's just sort of thinking about, what would fit based on people's coursework, but also availability. And then we've got our online students as well. So, so I'm thinking it's in, it'd be really nice to hear that feedback and understanding sort of what would work. And obviously you would think about your student representatives as well, and student unions as well. Everybody sort of has them. So, I'm just thinking about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, amazing. Apologies. Everyone make sure they've got their cameras off if you're not presenting, please. So, John, what about you on this one?
Yeah, I think a big part of being innovative is using the skills and the expertise that you've got in the university, which is generally your students when it comes to being innovative. I think they know better than us the sorts of things that might excite them and strike them as interesting. Dom was talking earlier about going around campus with a tabard. I mean, we tried all sorts of things. And I am very definitely not down with the kids, as my use of that phrase demonstrates. So I might think something is terribly innovative. And there was a point I had suggested whether we might do things over Facebook, and people sort of pointed out that nobody uses Facebook anymore. It's all Insta, which I still can't work. So I think listening to your students, and all universities have great groups of students. I think most universities will, in addition to the student union, but there will also be societies that are focused around these issues. We've got a great student society at UEA that's focused on mental health, and they run all sorts of events that connect to students in a way that things that are officially from the university struggle to make that same sense of connection. And I think as well can maybe approach things with a style that perhaps a university can't, that can sometimes be more engaging. But if the university took that line, could come off as, are you trivializing the issues? So the university has to adopt a certain approach because it's in a very particular relation to students. In a way, student societies can be freer in what they do. I think the other thing, it's not my strength, but making the most of the technologies that are available. It was mentioned earlier, sort of the difficulties that we all have in getting men to use our services. And we know that when there's been trials of chatbot based therapeutic tools, that seems to go down really well with men, precisely because there isn't a human at the other end. It's easier to unload, and as a man I can absolutely relate to that. I would feel much more comfortable talking to a machine. The issue there is innovation is often tied in universities to being more efficient. Quite often our innovations are part of our efficiency gain approach, and so we just always need to be careful that we don't strip out things that really do matter to students, like the in-person face-to-face encounters, because we have this other innovative thing. I think it has to be additional rather than instead of.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. Dom, how about you?
So I mean, John and Melinda have made really good points. I think what we're hearing and what we get told all the time is that peer influence is key. And I'm not a marketing expert, but I do understand that that is also, a really important principle when you're trying to influence people. So I think whether you call it co-creation or peer influence, you know, involving the student societies and so on, involving other students. I think that is absolutely the way forward. I think there are, you know, a variety of ways that are being used now. I think some universities have invited, for example, the Barbers Collective onto campus, where they will, you know, set up their chairs. The mainly lads will come along, sit in the chair, have their hair trimmed. I'm trying to think what the current cool phrase is, John, but like, you're not down with the kids, but something about having a nice trim or a nice shade or something. Anyway, they come along, they have that done, but the guys who are doing it, the barbers, are trained to get them talking, not to be therapists, but to then signpost them to the appropriate support. And it happens so subtly that it's a really non-intrusive way to talk about well-being with a group that might otherwise not ever walk through a door that has anything like counselling written above it, or, you know, something like that. So I think, you know, so for me, it's about, there's got to be loads of different options, you know, that thing about having choice. It might be that you want a chatbot, you might want a person, because what we know, and I'm sure John and Melinda would have heard this a lot too, is whenever you ask students what they want more counselling, they want more, you know, oh, we want more than 6 sessions, we want more counsellors. So lots of people are asking for that. May not be what actually is helpful, but the point is that's what they do ask for humans. But I do think the point is to have choice, lots of different options. I think I've heard, you know, so I think it was the Royal College of Music that I was talking to, but I did a session with them, and I was really making my point that I often do about, you know, tackling perfectionism and failure is okay, and all those things that really don't get, that message doesn't always get through as much as it should to our younger generation, that it's okay to make mistakes. So they were setting up some workshops, like lunchtime workshops, where the whole point was to come along and be creative with your music, but making mistakes was the key. So you learned from it, and it was a very practical way to do that. And you don't have to be the Royal College of Music to do that, of course. And I think, you know, there are more role models and different kind of influencers out there now who are not talking about the rubbish ones on TikTok, #ADHD, who don't know anything about it, but I'm talking about people who have maybe been through it or lived experience. Somebody like Sharpe, who, if you haven't seen his TEDx, it's great, as long as you're not easily offended by language. So SHOCKA, Sharpe. He's a fantastic grime artist. Can't say rap, wasn't rap, grime artist. And his music is all about mental health, well-being, and he's fantastic. But because of who he is, he gets loads of young men contact him saying, what do I do? I'm really, you know, anxious or stressed. And he's like, well, I'm not a therapist. So he will obviously then say, go here, go here. So I think, you know, getting, whether we use, you know, mechanics workshops or gardening, or one of my favorites, dudes with dogs, love that. You know, getting people together, peer influence, choice, chatbots, whatever it is, universities are doing this. It's happening, and we kind of do need to share some of those good practices a bit more, but they are happening.
Amazing, thank you. It's so interesting hearing about the different approaches. Kind of on a similar topic, what do you think is the best practice for promoting that support, and where it is and where you can find it? Should we start with John, because you brushed up on this last time?
I was looking ahead at the questions. I was preparing mentally for sharing best practice. Right, come on, brain. Promote it, yeah. The key thing is, what we tend to do, and this isn't just universities, it isn't just to do with these sorts of service, is we as the provider of a service will have a very clear idea in our head as to why that service is a jolly good thing that people should use, and we will tend to try and tell them that. And generally that's not the way you get people to use a service. It's odd, but it just isn't. I was reading a few months ago some interesting research about attempts to nudge better behavior in terms of sort of healthy eating, not smoking, not drinking, and the it can make you very unwell model doesn't persuade anybody. There's a great book called The Status Game, but I can't remember the author of it, which is really interesting. And you can exploit that, because if, on the other hand, you say it'll make you less attractive, even though that should be far less significant than you might die, if we're talking about, say, smoking, it has a much more positive impact. So I think what that tells us is we have to be really quite crafty and canny about how we promote. That it isn't, if you just say, come along to our mental health workshop, and you have all the information and it's really clear, that doesn't work. You've got to excite people. You've got to make people feel that it is going to be useful and meaningful and or interesting to them. We use our comms team a lot at UEA for this stuff, because they are the experts when it comes to communicating to our students. And then I think it comes back to, and some of the examples that Dom was giving were brilliant. I did write down the grime art. I'm so out of touch. I don't even know what that is, but it sounds great. But the idea of having a musical way in, for example. So it's not just about come and talk about this. There's an event that isn't directly about that, but it gets people talking about the issues, I think is brilliant. And I think you probably can't separate the promotion dimension from the how do you do things that are innovative dimension. I think they because actually being innovative and having these sorts of events is how you promote it, I suspect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dom, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think, lots of people are trying lots of different things and seeing, what sticks. I've always liked the expression throwing jelly at the wall, because it really sort of sums up, I think, current approach. We're all trying to be innovative and creative. But one way for if universities want to learn from each other, we just had a great conference where we had a different format from before. So the mental wellbeing in higher education, we've previously gone for a quite traditional sort of have a speaker, have maybe a panel or a workshop. But we also had loads and loads, like about 50 different people come from all different universities around the UK, and they just had a 15-minute slot or even a 5-minute slot, one after the other, to say, this is what we've been doing, basically showcase some new initiative they've been doing with the evidence, what's working, what's not. And it was a fantastic way for people to hear about hundreds of different innovations. And we did that with like a call for papers beforehand, and then sort of filtered through and sorted them into kind of groups of themes. And I think that is a fantastic way, then rather than just going and hearing, here's a case study in an OFS document, which is obviously very helpful, but is often for the quite high level, big projects, which a lot of people will just go, well, we can't do that. If you can just hear about, well, actually, we trained our personal tutors in just this one skill with this, workshop or 6 sessions or whatever, that can be really, I think, much more impactful for sharing and promoting between institutions. I think on campus, John said loads about it, really, absolutely right. It's all about peer influence and, appealing to the demographic that you're supporting, making sure that things are not badged to mental health. I have a big thing. I know we're all breaking down stigma. I actually think we've done loads on that over the last years, but we've seen that even when you break it down to a point where we sort of feel like, well, everybody's talking about it all the time in mental health, actually people are still not going to walk through a door that says, wellbeing, mental health, whatever. So we have to do it differently. We have to have things that will promote their mental health and well-being in a different way. And I actually think another thing you can do is tag on another incentive. So come along to this, whether it's a usually an activity of some sort, but it's, you know, we know that sneakily we're talking about wellbeing and mental health, but actually we're saying here are some skills for your employability, or here's some free food, always goes down a treat, you know. So basically you incentivize it with something else, and you know, you sneak in the good stuff as well.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that. Melinda, I'm wondering as if just generally the same question as well, but also if there's anything specific to Australia that you think is worth highlighting for this.
Yeah, like I completely agree with John and Dom around sort of, you know, those innovative ideas and, you know, sort of adopting that. And I think, you know, it's even, I suppose, like it's thinking about the whole student journey, because obviously a lot of our students are going through, you know, 3 to 6 year degrees. So, and that can be quite full on, I suppose, in regards to maintaining that mental stability or that emotional, I suppose, how do you manage that, or you know, build that resilience around those sort of things. But also, you know, I'm thinking about the pressure points, especially like obviously what this topic's all about. But you know, some of our degrees are, you know, as other unis as well, go out on placement, and you know, obviously, you know, I'm thinking about our paramedics, and especially around you know, being in an ambulance and going to accidents, and then, you know, it can be very varied, I suppose, of what they come across, and it's very unpredictable. So, you know, it's that, you know, building in curriculum as well, you know, how to continue with that well-being, I suppose, to where you can, and thinking about that innovation. Obviously, you've got to teach the content of it all. But I also think is in, you know, and sometimes, you know, it's feedback as well. I think sometimes when you deliver a subject, and I've been an academic as well, is, you know, it's really getting that meaningful and a really good system of feedback. And I think it's about understanding is in, you know, how did you find that content? How did you absorb that? Was that really useful? Because obviously, you know, students get really quite concerned about, you know, the exams or assessments that they have to put in place, you know, and obviously try and get a good grade with. So it's, you know, sort of, I'm just thinking of all the different points of a student's journey, you know, and it's a continuous thing, and where, you know, academic and, you know, our professional services really sort of parallel with each other as a student goes through their courses. And I think sometimes it's also, you know, even helping our academics. I'm just thinking, because obviously counselling, you know, you've got a team of clinicians and other people you're talking through, but sometimes our academics, you know, it's a tough gig, you know, managing so many students, and, you know, and giving them, you know, some of the tools and, you know, the things there that they can have that healthy conversation with a student. So, you know, things around pressure and on those particular stress points aren't get too big, I suppose, and then they're not sure what to do or how to answer that for a student as well, because that can be really hard. I don't know. I think that's, yeah, I'm just trying to think, because we've got a lot of often the students, and you know, we're even sort of thinking about, you know, especially our students that go on placement and obviously out to host agencies, is, you know, the ability to give them a call like a couple of times, just, you know, and students knowing that and just checking in. It's not like sort of a you know, checking in specifically just around their well-being, but just checking in to see how they're traveling, and, you know, is there anything that you know, we could do, or is everything going well with the placement before it gets you know, before anything, you know, particularly happens that's not okay, and causes further stress. And I think sometimes students feel a little bit scared about saying anything, because obviously, you know, that fear of failing, or that fear of, you know, saying something about their supervisor if it's not going well, and the repercussions there. So I think it's around sort of thinking about how do we really help the student, you know, throughout that journey, throughout their degree, as best we can. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's really insightful. Yeah. I'm wondering, I think John has frozen, but hopefully he may unfreeze at some point soon. Looking ahead, what do you think the future of mental health support for university students either will or should look like? And I'm going to start with you, Dom.
So for me, I think we're going to need to focus on that, essentially a population-based approach. We're going to have to go big, go wide. We cannot just be constantly reacting. I think we all recognise that. So we're going to have to look at the things that we can influence as universities, as people who work with students, and that might be, going back to those things I said at the beginning, the isolation, the belonging, you know, how do we get people to feel that they are part of something, which is such a basic fundamental human, you know, need. We need them to not feel anxious about all the uncertainty. Obviously there is uncertainty in life, and that probably isn't going to get easy. So how do we manage that? How do we give them the sense that they do have some control over it? How do they get involved? If they're worried about the climate, can we help them, you know, with the student societies to work around improving things? You know, if they're anxious about more specific things like exams, how do we work maybe running campaigns at around times that we know are high pressured and high risk, unfortunately, for students? So exam times, transition times, run campaigns about what to watch out for, where to get help, you know, focus them, target them at those anxieties. When we do talk to students about what worries them, they often say they don't know how to support their friends. So, you know, maybe some wide population-based approaches to supporting your friends in difficult times, what to do if you're worried about a friend. And of course, if we talk to academics and the non-specialist support staff, you know, we're going to have to go wide and talk to them about this isn't your job to fix the students, but be alert to the things that could be difficult going wrong. I always tend to use the phrase that an underperforming student is a student at risk. And so academics are often the first person to spot that a student is underperforming. And I don't just mean academically, I mean they might be underperforming, you know, in life. They might be coming and saying, oh, I'm just really struggling with this or that. And an academic person or in that department, you know, the person who sits, you know, in the administrative area or whatever, might be that person that the student chooses to tell them. So if we have that thought, underperformance is a risk factor for mental health issues, then maybe, you know, they'll be clued up, they'll signpost them, be alert. I think we're just, you know, my feeling is that the future for supporting student mental health, not very surprisingly, is a very wide approach. It's public health at the broadest level, but it's population-based approaches, belonging, that sort of thing.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Melinda, what about you?
I think Dom summed it all up. I'm just trying to think as in what else to add. Like, I think that you know, university is very tricky. I think sometimes, you know, I think students come into a degree and they don't realise the academic side of it all. I think it's that, you know, the pressure of being able to write really well, and then the, you know, the standing on it, I suppose, and how to reference, well, you know, all those little nuances that I suppose when you're doing a degree. And then going out on placement and what that looks like. So it's around sort of, I think, that constant communication as a university and having sort of that more student connection. I think, you know, students even co-designing certain initiatives, you know, and, you know, being part of those sort of things. I think with COVID, obviously, and I agree with Dom and John around, you know, that it's been really hard with COVID and everybody's been so isolated. So, you know, platforms like Zoom and Teams and all those sort of things have been key to, you know, communicate. But I think it is very different when you come in person, you know, and what that actually is and how that is, and having, because some people do develop that social anxiety as well and don't want to step away from that. So, you know, it's about sort of thinking about what would work for students and engaging them a little bit more. And I think they're simply just talking to them more. I think they enjoy, we've got intensives that come on our campuses and stuff. So students that have been online, you know, and want to do a 2-week intensive block, obviously for a certain course, you know, and having that and having sort of things, you know, initiatives and, you know, talking about, you know, just certain things, not always advertising services. I think that sometimes, you know, we can drown people out with what we do. But I think it's about sort of, you know, people can actually see who you are, and if you're, you know, part of the counselling service, you know, that connection and just having a chat. I suppose it's more yeah, about that sort of little bits, I suppose, of that human connection.
Yeah, definitely, it's really important. John, you look frozen on my screen, but
I was just sitting very
Oh.
still.
Wow, very okay, no problem then. On to you for the next answer then.
So it's hard to add much more to what Dom and Melinda have already said, and I agree with everything they were saying. I think that phrase about going big and going wide is really important. One of the things we need as a community to recognize and be really good at promoting is the fact that well-being and mental health is everybody's responsibility. It isn't the responsibility of student services or the well-being section within student services or the GP surgery. Is everybody's responsibility. And I think a big positive is we are seeing more of that. I think we're at a bit of a high point in terms of the status of well-being and mental health within higher education. You've got documents from UUK promoting appropriate activities. We've got Student Minds Charter. Whenever we hit a high point with something, I do start to worry about what comes the other side, because pendulums go both ways. And so I think in terms of, in the future, we will have to guard against the argument that says, because the resources available in HE are shrinking, and they are going to shrink, we know that this set of things are no longer as important, because actually they are key. And again, that's where the point about going wide is really important. The more academics that we work with understand the direct relationship between the wellbeing support, mental health support that a student has, and the academic output and the graduate employment output that the student achieves, the easier it will be to preserve those services. And then I think the other bit, this is a bit of a, but we've got Q&A afterwards. There'll be positive things after. This is a bit of a downer, which is the other bit about what's in the future is this growing pressure from, certainly in the UK, from government for universities to be healthcare providers, which we are not, for us to take on a level of responsibility that really just isn't appropriate. And I think the worst element of that actually is it signifies that in some areas, at least, we're still not taking mental health seriously enough, because we would never, ever, ever do this about a physical condition. You'd never see an article in a newspaper that said, why isn't this university providing a dialysis machine for this student? Because it's recognized that physical health conditions are serious and they need the appropriate expert input. But we still find ourselves having conversations around mental health, which suggests that it's not as serious. Well, why can't the university just, quote unquote, deal with it? I think we can combat that really effectively, and I think there's some really exciting stuff happening in terms of the ways in which universities and local healthcare providers working together and having conversations about where things sit and making sure that there are sort of seamless communication. So whether that's about the direct access you can have to a crisis team, regular meetings, so that we know where our boundaries are, but we're still talking to each other and working together to support the student.
Amazing. Yeah, I think those are all really important points. Yeah, as John mentioned, it's Q&A time now. So if anyone has any questions, please do drop them into the chat. Currently, there's none in there, so I'm going to fire away with one of my own. You've all been working on Pressure Points, our upcoming program. So I just wanted to get a quick highlight from each of you of something particular about the course either you're proud of or you think is really important, or is something that we need to talk about more, just anything you'd like to highlight about it. So John, start with you.
Yeah, I think the thing, we were talking about this before we started, the thing I really like about it is it's accessible. And we talk a lot about accessibility. It's one of the many buzzwords that we all use, but It really is, and that's really tough. I mean, I should be really clear. I am not an expert in well-being or in mental health. If I have any expertise, it's around sort of structures and management and things like that. I've sort of found my way into this stuff, but I am aware from talking to the people in my area who do provide these services of the really different distinctions. I mean, for example, the one I was struck by was the module that was looking at self-harming behaviour, and the fact that within that you are talking to an individual who might be engaging in self-harm. You might be talking to someone who has but isn't currently, or hasn't but is thinking about it. But you could also be talking to someone who is the friend of somebody. And to have an online module that can be navigated by each of those individuals and it work well for them is really tricky. And I think we've achieved that because of the people who were involved who are experts in that stuff. And it's very nuanced, but it's also really important to get it right.
Yeah, amazing. Dom, what about you?
So I would agree with all of that. I think it's a lovely set of modules, and I particularly like the fact that it's very interactive. You don't kind of snooze off reading loads of text or anything. It's very sort of, there are animations, and it's engaging, you know, it feels relatable, and I hope that that's what we try and make sure that for any student from all sorts of different backgrounds, there will be something in there that they connect with and that they feel, yeah, this applies to me, this is for me. And it's been written, you know, by people who have spent years, you know, supporting students, working with students, but also with student input. So, you know, it is really relatable. So whilst we talk a lot about these buzzwords, as John says, I think this actually does achieve those things. So I really like that about it.
Amazing. Thank you. Melinda?
Yeah, like I agree with definitely with John and Don, what they were sort of saying. I also like the bits and pieces where you can just add your own stuff. Like I think that's really nice, and then you can sort of obviously the one that we're working on now is, you know, being able to print it and have it just on hand. I think it's sometimes just to remember, you know, those particular moments where, like, it's back to journaling, I suppose, you know, back in my old clinical days, but, you know, having a diary and writing those things down and, you know, getting clients to do that. But I think that it's, you know, sometimes that would help certain students. So I like that aspect as well. And I agree with Dom that it's not something that, it's huge reading. Do you know what I mean? And it's not like it's something that's really tangible information, but a nice summary, I think, as well. Like it's a nice little intro to it all. Then you've got the activity, and then and just finish off with that nice summary. And I think that, you know, it's enough just to contain and absorb that information very quickly, rather than, you know, when you're really tired, I suppose, and if you're needing that opportunity, like, you won't miss anything, I suppose. You know, you won't miss that learning, or you have to read the text about 5 times to get it again. So I like that idea.
Yeah, amazing. So we've not had any questions come in, and we have 1 minute left. So the timing has kind of all worked out for the best. So a really big thank you to all of our speakers for being here today. It's been such an incredibly insightful conversation. I'd also really like to thank all of our speakers for contributing to Pressure Points. Just a little overview again for everyone. Pressure Points will provide flexible online support for students struggling with the pressures of university life, addressing key issues students are dealing with in light of the pandemic, and enabling wellbeing teams to focus on the really important complementary in-person initiatives and supporting students in crisis. If you would like to learn more about Pressure Points, I am just about to share my screen with some contact information. And there it is, hopefully. So these are academic partnership managers. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with them, and they'll be happy to help out with anything you'd like to see, whether it's a free trial or just have a better conversation about the programme. All that's left for me to say is thank you again for all of our speakers joining, and thank you for all of you for joining for watching. So I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.